Hello everyone, this is Leslie Dragon from Partners for Mental Health. Thank you for joining us for our webinar titled Stigma and How to Tackle It. We're thrilled to have our presenters join us today. We have Dr. Erin Michalak. She's an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of British Columbia. Her background is in psychology, with a PhD awarded from the University of Wales College of Medicine in the United Kingdom. She's the founder and leader of the collaborative research team for the study of psychosocial issues in bipolar disorder, a CIHR-funded Canadian network designed to foster psychosocial research and knowledge translation in bipolar disorder. We also have Victoria Maxwell joining us today as one of our featured presenters. She's the CEO of Crazy for Life company and a core member of CREST.BD. Since being diagnosed with bipolar disorder, psychosis, and anxiety, Victoria has become a sought-after speaker on the lived experience of mental illness and recovery, dismantling stigma and returning to work after a psychiatric disorder. For more than 15 years, she's been presenting keynote speeches, leading workshops, and performing her award-winning one-person shows at conferences and corporations across Canada and the United States. Thank you, Erin and Victoria, for being part of this webinar.
Thank you, Leslie, for that lovely introduction. It's Erin here, and we really are delighted to be able to join you today to discuss this really important topic. Here's what we're going to be covering in our time together. First of all, we're going to look at why we think it's important to specifically tackle stigma in the workplace. We're going to describe some ways mental illness stigma can manifest in workplace settings. And then from a lived experience point of view, we're going to talk about what it's like subjectively, from a personal point of view, to experience stigma in the workplace. And then we're going to end by introducing, we hope, some really kind of pragmatic and concrete approaches that you can use to reduce workplace stigma and to really create a safe environment for employees who may be or are facing mental health challenges, and to help them flourish in their jobs. So you're joining us today for this webinar, and really, it feels a little bit like preaching to the converted at this point. I probably don't need to tell you why this is an important topic to focus on, but at a very high level, we do know that perhaps 1 in 4 of the Canadian workforce at any point in time will be dealing with mental health issues whilst on the job. This really does have very significant impacts on the workplace itself. Mental health problems, of course, contribute to absenteeism in the workplace. They also, of course, contribute to presenteeism, when we're in our jobs but not really there or functioning fully, low productivity and turnover. Now, what we're here to focus on today is this relationship between stigma and flourishing in the workplace. It's really interesting for us to note some of these statistics, like those that come from the Mental Health Commission of Canada, that tell us that less than 1 in 4 Canadians would feel discussing a mental health condition with their employer. We think, therefore, that mental health issues in the workplace are likely to be underreported, that many employees are actually suffering silently. This is really important for us to be cognizant of, because this means that people perhaps are not accessing treatment in a timely manner at a point when they could actually address the mental health challenges that they're encountering and move on with their lives. So it's really, really critical for us to look at how we can diminish stigma in employment settings. We think this is a really important place to start. If you look at the research on stigma and the way we understand it theoretically or conceptually, this is pretty much a given in the research world, this understanding that stigma occurs at different levels. However, in our research within our CREST.BD network, one of the things we've come to realize is that this isn't often or always understood within the public discourse. So let's spend a moment focusing on this now, this idea that stigma can occur at different related but somewhat separate levels, and that we might want to tackle it at different levels. So first of all, we have self-stigma. This is a bit of a wordy definition, but self-stigma is really defined as the negative feelings that you might have about yourself, maladaptive changes in your behavior, changes in the way you feel about yourself, your identity, taking on or endorsing the stereotypes that are out there in society about what it means to have a mental illness, and then differences in perceptions of things that you think might happen in your environment because of stigma, or anticipation of negative reactions from others. So this is self-stigma, which is occurring kind of within the individual. Essentially, self-stigma is, in more simple words, endorsing and internalizing societal representations of mental illness, which may be accurate or inaccurate. Social stigma is the next level, and this describes the process or the phenomenon of social groups endorsing stereotypes about and acting against a stigmatized group, treating them differently, essentially. And then finally, we have this idea of structural stigma. Structural stigma is that which occurs at the wider level, at the macro level, and really this is referring to things like the rules and the policies and the procedures of big groups, social institutions, for example, workforces, that restrict the rights and opportunities for people with mental illnesses. One thing that is really important for us to know is that within the workplace, we're not just really talking about dealing with social stigma or structural stigma, we're also talking about ways of dealing with self-stigma. We think that if we can create safe work environments for people, if they feel like they want to disclose that they're having mental health challenges, that we can also have the power to address self-stigma at this point. So we can really tackle stigma in the workplace at each of those intersecting levels. So let's lighten this up a bit and take it away from those kind of wordy theoretical understandings. This is Piglet, of course. Piglet is experiencing swine flu stigma. We show this slide sometimes when we're presenting and teaching, and we ask people to really have a think about what types of stigma Piglet is experiencing. From my perspective, he looks pretty sad, eh? He looks like he could be, self-stigmatizing himself a bit there. He's certainly experiencing some social stigma from his friends and from Eeyore there, and it looks like he's also having some structural stigma going on, and that his access is being reduced here. So I would posit that Piglet is experiencing stigma at all three levels there. Now, we've conducted a lot of research within our network, specifically in the area of the relationship between bipolar disorder and stigma. And although we're going to be talking about bipolar disorder quite a bit in this webinar, we're really using it just as a lens. Much of what we'll be talking about would relate to people with depression, psychotic type disorders. So I don't really think what we're talking about is necessarily specific to bipolar disorder, but this is, our bread and butter of what we do, so it's the lens that we'll be using. This was a qualitative study, which means that we sat down and did focus groups and interviews with people who are living with bipolar disorder, and we really talked to them about how they understood stigma at those different levels that we just talked about, what it was like on the ground for them to experience self, social, or structural stigma. You can download any of these papers on the website that's provided. There's just one quote from that data that I'm going to share with you now, which was one of the most powerful ones for me and really stuck out for me. This was a woman who was describing how she was treated in the workplace when her daughter had had a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. And she said, if my child had leukemia, you'd all be bringing me lasagna. And what she was referring to within that narrative that she gave was how it's very different to experience a physical condition, what's considered perhaps more a physical condition, like cancer, like a broken leg, compared to a mental health condition, and how those different conditions are treated very different socially and very different in society. This was another study that looked specifically at self-stigma and people with bipolar disorder, and I just wanted to touch on this one very lightly to tell you about some of the things that people were describing in terms of how they navigated through stigma and dealt with it effectively. Many of the samples said that the best ways that they had found of coping with stigma were often through a lot of hard work, moving beyond a state where they were experiencing a lot of self-stigma or internalized stigma. So they had to work very hard to become more resilient around those societal perceptions of what it means to have mental illness and not to internalize that. They spoke a lot in this study about something that they called judicious disclosure. This was often described in the workplace and how people made very complex decisions often around who to disclose their mental health conditions to and who not to disclose to. And then this idea, this theme of sense of self or identity came up, and Victoria's going to be touching on this later, the idea that for many of these people, perhaps when they were first diagnosed with bipolar disorder, it was almost all of who they were. It was an overshadowing condition. With time and when they were in recovery, many of them spoke about having then compartmentalized their bipolar disorder. So it was just one aspect of who they were and not all of who they were. The final research slide that I want to show you is around what's called a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis is where we take lots of different studies together and use a very thorough technique to tell us the overarching story, to see what the overarching story that the data is telling us. This is a meta-analysis of predictors of favorable employment outcomes for people with bipolar disorder. So what are the ingredients of success, essentially, in the workplace for people to flourish with bipolar disorder? It's interesting to note that some of the things that were brought out in this meta-analysis or this review are hard to change. So you were more likely to do well in the workplace, for example, if you had good cognition, if you had a higher baseline rate of education, if you had a lower severity of illness, or you just had one type of mental health condition as opposed to multiple types of mental health conditions. However, equally important to note are these two last factors, that flourishing in the workplace was associated with your ability to cope with stigma and good relationships at work. So, it's the idea of, we've unpacked what stigma is, the impacts it might have for people in the workplace. How do we actually start to tackle it and reduce it in workplace settings? And this is the point of the presentation where we're really going to get a bit more interactive, and we're going to talk point by point through a number of different strategies together. First of all, this idea around education, about learning the facts. There's a good body of evidence telling us that one of the very best ways, the most concrete ways of addressing stigma is really understanding what mental health conditions are and what they're not, and sharing that knowledge with others. And so, Victoria, I'm going to pass over to you to unpack that a little bit in terms of what it means for you from a lived experience.
Thanks, Erin. It's really great to be part of this webinar. One of the most important things for myself, but also for those who were supporting me both in the workplace and at home, was really understanding what mental illness is and isn't in terms of breaking down the myths, breaking down my own fears. And one portion of that, and the reason that was important, was because what it allowed me to do was feel more comfortable reaching out for help, because I knew what the facts were as opposed to making assumptions about what it meant to have a mental illness. And it also allowed me to find out what my needs might be. And so the more education I had around what mental illness was and wasn't really helped me feel more empowered, and in some ways allowed me to let go or begin the process of letting go of some of the internalized stigma that I had actually already started to experience. And then for what it also allowed me to do was be able to help raise awareness, which we'll get into in the next point, with others. And so being able to share that knowledge confidently gave me an opportunity to really feel like I could stand behind what I said, and also marshal support for myself. And this was really helpful for those who were part of my support system, like my family and those people in the workplace that I really leaned on when I needed to. And so there's something very powerful about knowing what the facts are and being able to really speak to them, and speak to them clearly and confidently.
That's interesting, Victoria, but when you use the words confidence and marshalling, it really did sound like you were describing a process of empowerment through education as part of that.
Yeah, because I think there's a lot for myself when I was diagnosed and I had gone into the hospital due to psychosis a number of times. My identity had shifted, and what you had spoken about in terms of that societal and social stigma, I automatically, even without knowing it, had taken on some of that and started to do some self-stigmatizing. And so there was a process, in hindsight I see, of me being able to take small steps, but really important steps, in order to shift that so that I sort of became, sort of stood back into my power and started to shift my identity from someone that, for lack of a better word, felt like I was my mental illness to someone who was living with a mental illness.
And so the next point we have, which is around raising awareness within work environments, knowing what resources are available locally and within your specific work environment.
Yeah, so for me, part of that was knowing what the facts were so that if I needed to and I wanted to share the knowledge, I could actually help raise awareness that way. But also knowing in terms of whether I was supporting someone or I was needing support myself, knowing the resources available, whether there was an employees assistance program, whether there were local support groups, where I could find out about good therapists. A lot of this was coming, let's say, from appointments with a good GP, a referral to a psychiatrist, and additionally knowing of good evidence-based websites that were able to help support me in a way that I may feel more comfortable with in the beginning. So a lot of times initially it wasn't comfortable for me to be walking into a mental health center, and it took courage eventually where it was a non-issue. But in the beginning, knowing resources like what books to read, self-help books, and other kinds of other kinds of websites really made a difference, because I could do it in the comfort of my own home, and I was able to sort of really search specifically for what I was needing. And there's a whole community that of support that actually can help sort of tackle the stigma that I, in particular, was holding about my own identity. I found when I was able to speak with other people, there was an understanding that people who had gone before me and were further down the road in recovery helped clarify a lot of the things I was already going through. And that was really essential for me, both in my recovery and then also being able to reach out and raise awareness.
Thank you. And presumably that's not just about awareness raising and knowing about the resources yourself. Presumably there's something that colleagues and managers can do around that as well, because it becomes particularly hard for people to navigate to resources if they're in an episode and they're struggling. So being ready to go within the staff and the supervision systems within workplace environments so that you can support people if they do come to you for help, and knowing about the best resources that are available is presumably part of that too.
Yeah, and one of the things that I find is that in corporations and corporate cultures, when people know of resources to help individuals with mental health issues, it actually decreases the stigma, because there's an inclusive environment of it's not something where people have to find it on their own. There's a dialogue that's already going on about it. So the actual availability and knowledge of managers or supervisors knowing about it sort of creates this kind of inclusive culture where it's not a taboo subject, where there's already sort of a vernacular that people can talk about. And so it creates it decreases barriers for those employees who may be struggling to reach out for help.
That's a really nice segue into our next point, Victoria, which is around communication. I'm wondering if you can dive into that one.
There's several parts to this. Part of it is about derogatory comments and names. We all have known about when somebody says, oh, she's nuts, or he's psycho, or he's so schizoid. Really, they're incredibly demoralizing and derogatory, and it's still, to me, so surprising how often it's used. It's still somewhat a socially acceptable kind of discrimination. And if you've allowed yourself to sort of learn some of the facts about mental illness and you know resources, there's an opportunity, whether you're a colleague or a manager or living with mental illness yourself, to be able to speak up and clarify, or at least not just be a bystander. Because the silence that occurs within corporations, and any conversation really, can really be detrimental to people's process of recovery, and it really becomes, what I found in the initial stages was that these were illnesses of secrecy, where the shame prevented me from talking about it because I knew what some people's opinions were. And the opinions were based on the sort of jokes that we're making, the kind of derogatory comments. And so if I hear something, sorry, go ahead. No, so if I hear something, it's a really opportune time for me to step in and sort of clarify whether it's a misconception about the connection between violence and mental illness, that there isn't that connection through the evidence, and being able to refer to where that information is, and also just being able to recognize that it's inappropriate. And I have sort of I call it a double standard, but for someone that's lived through mental illness and someone who has really had that direct experience, I go, if you want to make a joke about it to make it easier to talk about, I use a lot of humor. I don't do it so that it's at the expense of others, but I find that it's a way to break the ice. If you don't have a mental illness or haven't lived through it, then to me it's the equivalent of sort of saying, you know, if you're Italian, you can make Italian jokes. If you're not Italian, it's off limits. And I think it's really can be empowering, but it's such a personal decision. It depends on what your comfort level is. But for me, using humor has been a really important aspect of my recovery and my sense of empowerment.
Great response, thank you. We touched on this a couple of times already, this idea of identity and sense of self, and focusing on the whole person rather than the mental health challenges that they're facing, which are just one part of them.
So looking at the whole person, as you said, for me, it was really recognizing that as I got further along in understanding the illnesses that I had and managing them, that this isn't something that defines me. It's part of my history. It informs my experience, but it doesn't define me. And particularly, this goes a little bit to the point above about person-first language. So instead of saying a schizophrenic or a bipolar person, it's a person with a mental illness. So, or I'm someone, an individual who lives with bipolar disorder. And this allows a slight, subtle, but really important adjustment in recognizing that I'm a person first, and I just happen to have a mental illness. And to me, we were talking about this earlier, that it's similar to, let's say, someone who has is an immigrant and has immigrated to Canada. Their experience of being an immigrant is part of their experience. It's not their identity. It informs what they can bring, and this actually moves into abilities and limitations, that those experiences really can be mined as assets. So interestingly, some of the things for myself that I initially thought would be considered limitations or liabilities are actually assets that are valued by employers. And it took a while to recognize what those were, but part of it was perseverance, innovative thinking, creativity, loyalty, hard work, all these things that are on the soft skills end of things, but are vital for making an employee a very, very valuable employee. I speak to college students and university students often who have disabilities, and looking at reminding them that those skills are exceptionally valued and are transferable, because the resilience that we need to have, the perseverance that we need to have to move through the chronic illness like mental illness, can really impact what we bring into the workplace and can be of great value.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And our last point on this slide, we couldn't do this webinar without getting into disclosure a bit. There's a couple of things I wanted to mention here from a more research perspective. First of all, one of the greatest drivers of stigma is the fact that many people who are doing very well with mental illnesses aren't disclosing for fear of stigma. Therefore, they're flying under the radar. But the people that we are witnessing as struggling with mental health conditions, who are symptomatic, are much of what we see in terms of, the range of experiences in mental health conditions. So it's a kind of, uneven or, misdistributed perception that we have of what it means for the most people to live with mental health conditions and how many people actually recover and do just fine. So there's that piece of it. And then there's the piece where we look at interventions to tackle stigma. And we know from the research that one of the most powerful interventions we have is what we would call contact-based approaches. So it's pretty simple. It's, working or being exposed to, working with or being exposed to somebody who's in recovery from their mental health challenges and giving you the chance in a very pragmatic way to break down some of your own negative perceptions potentially about them. So we have these two pieces at play here. And I just wanted to pass over to you, Victoria, to bounce off that.
What I've found one of the most powerful things is when I've seen leaders in particular share their story of living with mental illness or loving someone who has a mental illness. And it reminds me of the former CEO of Coast Capital here, Lloyd Craig, whose son died by suicide. And what it did was that he opened up the conversation within the credit union that he was CEO of and the environment that he was trying to develop. And so recognizing that it was such a personal issue for him, he chose to disclose. And what that did is it modeled being able to say, this is okay, that it's not a taboo subject, there's no shame in it, and we need to talk about it because it can be obviously an incredibly serious and potentially fatal illnesses. And so I think if you're in a position to share, and as you had said earlier, that it's really a complex decision about when you're disclosing and not, but if you are in a position, it can create incredible inroads in companies, any size companies, and you don't know the ripple effect that it has, yet it's one of the most amazing things when you start to recognize how common it is. And I think this is the difficulty, is that our point of reference, as you had mentioned, is really the media. So we often see very sensationalized, very tragic cases of individuals who have mental illness, often untreated mental illness, but we don't see those individuals who are thriving in the workplace, thriving in our community. So we have a really skewed image of what it means to have mental illness, and so it's a sort of a reinforcing kind of stigma that happens. And because it's an invisible disability, we don't know the next person who has mental illness and who doesn't. So it really, I really feel that if you have the right culture, sort of corporate culture support, that it's really important to disclose. But it's also weighing the consequences and the benefits, why you want to share, what will happen if you do, who are your support, and what is your support system around that. So I think that it can work from both the top down and from the bottom up. And I think it's obviously an individual choice, but it really can make a positive impact on people's lives. And what I've found mostly, I mean, my job really in the work that I do is disclosing, is that the most of the response is, hey, I know someone, my cousin or my sister, or you know what, I have. And it creates this supportive environment and the more support that we have and the more inclusive an environment, that's how we start to tackle stigma, and it starts to get dismantled one step, one voice, one story at a time.
That was really nicely put, Victoria. Thank you. So let's get into some tools and resources, shall we? Those of you on the line today and listening into this webinar, you're in a Partners for Mental Health webinar, so you will be intimately familiar probably with the wonderful resources provided as part of the Not Myself Today campaign. Of course, there are many other webinars, resource sheets, videos embedded within this website, and we encourage you to keep this conversation going and keep your edification going through this wonderful resource center. Just to point out a few others that you may or may not be aware of course, the Mental Health Commission of Canada has been one of our other big national leaders in terms of really focusing on stigma and workplace mental health. The national standards for psychological health and safety in the workplace were released in 2013. Embedded within this section of the Mental Health Commission of Canada's website are a lot of other excellent tools and resources, and in particular we'll point you to the archived webinar series that they also have. Many of those focus on stigma specifically or other more nuanced areas of workplace functioning that may be of particular interest or value for you and your particular organization. These are some of the resources that we provide through our collaborative bipolar disorder research network. There's two that I'm going to just touch on with you at this point. I'll do that by just showing you the websites that we've produced down here. So what we have is two websites that kind of exist in parallel. I'm not going to go through them in great detail, but I would like to make you aware of them. They're both geared for people with bipolar disorder, but in many ways, many of the resources that I provide with them, they're certainly not going to do any harm. They're around, workplace functioning, stigma, lifestyle factors that would be pretty similar for people, whether you're facing depression, bipolar disorder, schizoaffective disorder, for example. This is the quality of life tool. We have mentioned being aware of good resources to tell people about if you're a manager or a supervisor or a colleague supporting somebody else. This is a project where we developed an online method for measuring quality of life in people with bipolar disorder. It's of interest because it measures 14 different areas of well-being. One of those areas is workplace functioning. So the very first question you get as you go into the scale is, are you doing any work currently? Are you in school? And then it will ask you questions about those specific domains if you are in the work environment. There's about 56 questions in there, and it asks you across different areas of life functioning how you're doing. So for example, right now I'm in the physical domain, and you can see what you get is a nice kind of graph that builds up over time that shows you the areas that you're flourishing in and the areas that you're struggling in. And then it gives you feedback at the end of the questionnaire and links you into specific tools and resources according to the areas that you might want to pay some attention to. So for example, right now I'm saying that actually my mood's been pretty poor over the past 7 days. And then what it would do at the end of the questionnaire is direct me specifically through to resources to support mood. So that's the quality of life tool. I mentioned that tool serves as a gateway into kind of resources more broadly, and these are all housed in this bipolar wellness center that we've built. You can see that the way that the information is organized on this website is according to those different domains again. So for example, right now we're talking about stigma. The stigma domain is actually kind of nested under this idea of self-esteem. So if somebody wanted particularly to focus on stigma and bipolar disorder, self-esteem and bipolar disorder, what they can access here is the very best, a very good summary of the research evidence in this area, and importantly, access specific tools and resources. So if you were to go into this link down here, you would find some stigma-specific tools. And then what we also have within the website is a number of webinars and videos. So they can access one of 14 webinars in different areas. So for example, one of these webinars focuses on work and bipolar disorder. This one focuses on stigma and bipolar disorder. And then there are also a number of videos that have been produced. And just to mention to you at this point that in March of this year, of 2016, we'll be releasing 3 new videos that focus specifically on flourishing in work settings with mental health challenges. So kind of watch this space for those tools and resources. Going back to the slides again, these are what we've produced within CREST.BD. I just wanted to mention as well something that Victoria and I were very heavily involved in for a number of years. This was funded by the Canadian government. Victoria developed, wrote, and performed a new play called That's Just Crazy Talk. We've designed this play specifically to tackle stigmatizing attitudes towards people with mental health challenges using an arts-based approach. And then we evaluated it through a number of live performances around Canada, and then we also produced a filmed version of it. And we tested whether the filmed version and the live version actually had any impact on people's attitudes. They did. There was a significant impact of both the live show and the DVD recording in terms of people's misperceptions and misconceptions about mental illness. And so the DVD recording of this, which is available through Victoria's website, could be a good conversational starting point for you within workplace settings perhaps. It's about 50 minutes, and we use it a lot in teaching settings just to start that conversation going, to break down some of those barriers. You can access information about all of the other CREST.BD tools and stuff that we've produced and keep track of our work through these social media and website platforms. And I'll just leave that up for a second, and then it's time for us, I think, to close down the webinar and to really, Victoria, I think you'll join me in this, wanting to say a very warm thank you for coming together and giving your time to focus on this important area. Really, it's going to take a societal approach to break down stigma, and you're a big part of it. Your being here today is a big part of that. Victoria, I'll let you close down.
Yeah, I'd just like to express my gratitude as well, because it was really through supportive workplaces that allowed me to step into better quality of life, better recovery, in particular one boss and manager where I felt so supported, and even in times when I was struggling, I was able to continue working and find that balance of management in my own illnesses, and it's allowed me to thrive in the career that I have now. So for those of you that are on the call, you are those people, and that really makes a huge difference to the individuals who you may be working with or supervising, or perhaps you yourself. And it makes a difference not only in companies but in people's lives. So a big thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Erin and Victoria, for sharing the tools and the resources, and Victoria for sharing your own story and your experiences and really bringing it to life. And I as well would like to echo that and thank everyone for joining us today in this webinar. As we were saying, I mean, it really takes everyone to do their part to create a mentally healthy workplace and to really play an active role in tackling the stigma in our workplaces. So we certainly appreciate you joining us today. Thank you again, Erin and Victoria, and we encourage you to check out the resources pointed out today in today's webinar, and also to visit the employee portal through Not Myself Today for more educational resources and tools. So thank you.